Okay, so here we are in the final nodes video. After this one, we'll be going into some more regular processes, but for now, we have to finish off these nodes. So what we'll do is we'll go through these final set here and talk about how these color nodes work and the mesher and the portal. The output is eventually going to be discontinued, so we don't really need to pay too much attention to that. And the mesher is, of course, is listed in the other video on exporting, so we'll just kind of briefly cover it. For now, however, we're going to go through this color set. So if I right-click on this and I say pin for color, that will mean that this particular height information will be utilized in previewing the color nodes that are generated. For many things, you don't want to necessarily use the height for it. You may want to use different kinds of data maps or selectors in order to get a result. And sometimes you can just grab any of the primitives as well as sort of the source of the color, which I've done on more than one occasion. So really, it's converting the black and white data that comes off of these different things into color. And this is the primary action of these. If we start off with one of the more basic ones, let's say QuickColor, go ahead and grab that, and you'll see that it's generating essentially just a height map because it's coming off of the height output, and it generates just a quick color. So if I change the color, I get this. We have some options for it. We have things like we can reverse it, in which case the darkness comes up here and the lightness goes down there. Because it's always going to black, we don't have a huge amount of control over that. So if you want to blend it, you're going to want to do something where you're using a mixed node, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, to sort of overlap the areas that you don't want. Or you're going to be looking at this as something that you'll do as a screen or an add in order to make sure that the black is not added in, unless of course you wanted that. So the QuickColor also has things like the input clarity, which will sort of like almost well, you have an auto level here, but it refines maybe perhaps the gamma of it, just so that you get a little bit more contrast there. And the same thing for the output clarity. Again, provides a little bit of contrast in a way there. And of course we have the output auto level, which maximizes the brightness and darkness between those regions. Adding input noise takes that information, the visual information, and it sort of blurs it and adds noise. So you'll see that most prominently around the barrier of that. And if we were to do the color noise, what you'll see, typically speaking, let's just add a lot of that, is banding that will happen with that. So it can be useful, but I think the input noise is a little bit more reliable in terms of usage. Not that this isn't reliable, I mean it does what it does, but in terms of making use of it, probably the input noise will be a little bit better for you. I'm going to delete that one, and we'll move on to a slightly more advanced version of that, which is the color node. So this is the color lookup table, and if you're familiar with Photoshop and the gradient remap tool, this is essentially it. Or in Maya, a common way to remap colors, people take one of the channels from an image and plug it into the v-coordinate of a ramp, and that again does the same thing. So this is a very common process across multiple softwares, and it's basically to take black and white information and then convert it into a reusable gradient, where you can take these things, you can move the values around, or take them and change them in terms of their overall color. So you can of course create absolutely horrible creations, and of course even insert some additional colors in between, as many as you want, and just moving them around to get them into different positions. So it's just a matter of choosing the value and saturation as well as the hue, and off you go. Similar to the other node that we just looked at, it has all the same additional features, which there isn't really any difference here. That's it. So that allows you to manually pick your colors, and of course when we're doing these, we want to use these different inputs. You can see in here now this is putting the blue into those regions because that's where that blue is showing up, and the green is going everywhere else. And I'm really not seeing any of the red, probably because this particular output is not going that high. It's not going to white. So moving along, we also have SAP Maps. So the SAP Maps are that same deal. They are gradients, just like what we just looked at, and so we're moving up in that complexity, right? The QuickColor is just a dark color with whatever color you want to pick. Clutter allows you to pick individual colors, making more complex gradients, and then of course these are pre-made gradients. Each one of them, a huge number of them, different in terms of the color combinations that they have, and of course the complexity of them or smoothness of them, and these are all taken from photographs. So if I apply them in height mode, of course I get this based on height, so we see this separation going there. But if I were to base them off of something, say like this, where I've got flow and velocity kind of combined together to create this black and white map, you can see how it relates to the surface. Converting that into a SAP Maps, we can see how it applies then the color with those. And so we can sometimes get some really interesting and somewhat reliable looking results in terms of making it look like, or starting to look like, maybe dirt and sand and stuff like that. So that's SAP Maps. Moving along, we have Synth, which is again the same idea as a SAP Map. In fact, it's exactly the same idea as a SAP Map. And we'll go back to the SAP Maps in just a second because there's a couple of features I didn't talk about there. But the difference with this one is that it will create a SAP Map for you. So you go ahead and click to open an image, and then of course you can determine the number of stops in the image where it will go and collect a color and create these individual slices. You can of course make them fuzzier, and then of course you can rotate through the selection, moving those points around in the graph, and then the seed of course to change it. And then we have all those same features that we've had in the other nodes. They're all here, they're just ordered differently, but they're all the same thing. So back in the SAP Maps, again we have these things. We have the noise, which is pretty straightforward. Like if we look at this and we see how broken up that is, the reason why you would want to use it is it will sort of spread that out, right? It provides a little bit of a kind of blur to those features. So where those stark changes might have been a little bit off-putting, this now is not so bad. And then we have jitter to shift some of those values around, and then the same other stuff that we've looked at already, the reverse and input clarity, and output auto level, and all that kind of stuff. So moving on, now we're looking at editing and breaking things up. So if I go with my color effects node, color effects node is the way of just editing things. So in order for it to work, you have to, of course, turn it on, enable it, and then the default settings will be the same as what is here, so you'd have to change them, make them brighter or darker. Maybe that's a bit too much. And if, of course, you want to reset these, you can just right click and then hit the home button and it will go back to normal again. Increase and decrease contrast. Turn that off. Hue, let's apply the hue. So this is quite useful because sometimes you get a variation that you like, but you want it to go in a different range. Often do this, bring something into sort of this bluish range and then desaturating it for sort of stone colors. And then, of course, we can lighten or darken these very similar to the brightness that's up here. It's all built into this. We also have the ability to change for auto levels, taking the colors in there and just changing that range, which we could have done in the SAP Maps to begin with, but this gives us an additional control in that we can determine how much of that we want. So that's the difference. Equalize tries to equalize all the values, and we have gamma control. We have an auto gamma, which will try and get the best possible brightness. Oops, we should apply the gamma first to see that change. Right, and it tries to readjust it, what it thinks might be optimal, or you can input those values yourself. Keep in mind that the way that gamma works is it keeps white at white, black at black, and moves those mid values in between. So you can find yourself kind of compressing or stretching certain regions of the color. What gamma is particularly useful for is, in many texture cases anyways, is that lowering the gamma makes the same kind of effect that you would see as something getting wet. And increasing it is the same kind of value you might see of something getting dusty or more diffuse. So if you were to take stone, for example, and it was getting worn down a lot and really roughed up, then upping the gamma will give it that kind of dusty, dried out kind of look, and then lowering the gamma would give it the look like of wet surfaces. So if you wanted to mimic the idea of water impacting a certain region, then of course gamma is pretty useful for that. If we go with clarity, this is the same feature that we see in these other ones, and not much change in this particular case, but in others there will be. And of course applying noise just to break things up again, soften the features that are there. And you have a seed for that. So these are all the adjustments that you can apply to existing color information. And this can come from all sorts of sources, like you can come directly from the grayscale, but if I go directly from grayscale, something that you might want to be aware of is you notice that even though I've gone from grayscale here and I've tried to apply more saturation, adjust the hue, it doesn't colorize. So unlike the hue saturation changer inside of Photoshop, you won't get color unless there's already existing color. So you need color to start with, which is where something like the QuickColor can come in handy, because that'll give you a solid basic color without a lot of changes that you can play with. Continuing to move along, there are situations when you might be adjusting these things or maybe wanting to use color information coming off of it as a single channel to control things like masking, or even if you wanted to process it with some of these other tools. Processing, of course, with these other tools doesn't work well with color, and so you have to handle the individual channels. So this is where we have the RGB Split and the RGB Mix. They're both the same node, it's just one is an output breaker, and the other one is a input combiner. So if we go ahead and plug that in, this node has no other features other than the fact that we can output all 3 channels or each channel individually. And if we wanted to combine multiple things together to create something like, say, a splat map, where we took, say, the output of wear, deposit, and flow, and we want to input them to red, green, and blue channels, that would then output that, and we can play with that. So if I were to just plug those in, and that's not super intense, but you can kind of see some of it there. So there's no auto level like there is in some of these other tools. And so right now it looks a little bit dark, but you could, of course, auto level those yourself if you wanted to make them a little bit stronger. Continuing along, what do we have left? Well, we've got the mixer, and we have the biome. So the mixer, very similar to what we've already discussed in a previous video, which is the combine node. It has all the same blending features. It's just dealing with color data. So we have the blend, add, screen, subtract, multiply, and all those things in there. So they're all the same. And of course we have a mask to blend between them, so how much you want of each one. So that's fairly straightforward. The last one, which is probably the least straightforward and the more complex to sort of get into, is the biome. So saving this one for last, you can see there's quite a lot of options and features in here. We have different colors for the different regions that we can click and pick some basic colors from. We have, in the node itself, we have an input, a visualization, and an influence. So the input and the influence both deal in gradient information. Height is automatically being processed in here as well. But the influence creates sort of a secondary mask for that. So we have the main input, which is one of the ways in which it processes the color information, the different zones for highlands, midlands, lowlands, etc. And then the influence is another one where it processes again. So if we take a look at this, I have this in a really simple mode right now. You can see this gray coming down into these areas and even down into here where we see that gray and then that same green. So we're going from gray to this green, and then we're seeing it down here again, and it's just a different kind of model of height information going through there. So those two different masks are masking two different height ranges of this color. With this right here, we have the option for applying highlands or not. If we go ahead and eliminate the highlands, you'll see that the highland information, that color range, goes away. And the same thing for the midlands and then the lowlands. There's also a deserts region, which is these tan areas, and then changing no deserts, of course, we'll do that. The highlands, midlands, and lowlands, we have height information for them. So you notice how they're in a sort of a gradiating level here. This is where the highlands start, between here and here, and then this is your midlands, and each one kind of overlaps the other. So if you move the midlands to a different region, you'll find that it will be overlapping with some of the other color information that's there. Seed, pretty straightforward. We have a good idea what that does. Adding jitter, of course, will break up the pattern between these. So we'll get something that's a little bit more noisy, so that gives that breakup. It's very similar to the distribute option that we've talked about here, the distribution. We also have another feature which is not on by default, which is the precise. And if I turn off the precise, you will notice this grainy noise kind of going through it, whether you're interested in that or not. So that breaks up that surface. When combined with the jitter, it creates a different kind of breakup. So it just adds some more variation to the shape of the breakup. So of course precise will instead eliminate that pattern and keep everything relatively sharp. Coming along next, we have the scale and influence. So adjusting the scale will adjust the scale of the height information. So you see that range in there has changed. These guys didn't change, but the area of influence has. So how far, how deep a range that change happens. So you notice that our deserts have moved up in that region within that secondary mask region. Take back the influence. And the strength of its impact goes away. Let's bring it back up. And you can see these things have popped back in. So it's because my influence is coming from the flow. Whereas we're coming off the deposit here, which we're not seeing properly, so we'll just go back to this. If I were to change this input to this other set that I've shown already, we'll see a different result. So now it's based on that flow information. We have a sea level and the water bodies option. So you can see how that impacts this blue region that we're seeing here, turning off the water bodies. And that's also, again, related to that scale feature. So it would be, you know, creating little lakes if we were using something like deposit maybe. You can play with the different masks. So that's the biome, and that's all of those features in there. So in another video we'll talk about making use of these in a little bit more of a practical manner. But for now we'll just finish off these guys. So the mesher node, we have a vertex count that we can apply and the format that we would be checking off. We have some features which are not yet available but will be in the near future. To work on this, you just simply have to right click and you can input the value here, or we can go ahead and double them using powers of 2 very quickly. And of course we can choose whether or not we want to make lower levels of detail and how many do we want to do. So, you know, 2048 and then 1024 and then 512, you know, breaking it down. How many different levels do you want to create? Moving on to the portal. So a portal node allows you to break off information from one area to another. So if I were to take this and say drop it on the combine node, it will connect that and you'll see we have the combine output. Of course, if that's not the one I wanted, maybe I wanted the separation value, I could go ahead and connect it there, and I would get the combined separation. Now this was auto labeled by how it was created upon creation. So if you wanted to change that label, you're going to have to change it yourself by going in and renaming it. The way that creating its partner works is simply taking the portal and then connecting it to that, and you'll get the opposite portal. And this portal now could be connected to things. So if I were to go ahead and reconnect that one and connect this to here instead, I still get the same thing. It's still doing exactly the same feature. It's just breaking that off so that I don't have to keep them in the same space. The primary usage of this, of course, is to break up sections. So if you wanted to go ahead and create like an area that was just about masking a certain area, you can output to a portal and then have that branch go across. And then you'll have an idea of like, this is one area and then this is another feature, and then you could break off again to go into color, and you could break those off to say like, this is all my grassland areas and this is my desert area, and so on and so forth. So portals are essentially a really good organizational tool. So as always, hopefully you found this relatively informative. You've got a good idea to start you playing with these, and experimentation, as I keep on saying, is probably the best way of handling them. Oh, I do have one more that I haven't touched. I see it there, peeking at me. The normal map. I've already plugged it too. The normal map. If you know about normal maps, this is the kind of texture that you would use to mimic the idea of surface detail. So it records normals, one normal per pixel. In this particular case, it's recording what I would refer to as sort of an object space map. You can call it a tangent space map because it is based off of the simple like one quad, but it's not necessarily the kind of normal map that you would want to utilize unless you wanted to see it maybe from the top, from a distance, or very shallow angles, because it doesn't change the silhouette. So a normal map is not going to give you this height information, and I can't use this on a lower poly version of the same thing because, again, that's not the same deal, unless I went maybe object space. So future versions we may get something a little bit different, but it's here. Flip Y, you can change the direction. This is again for different engines. They want to have it in a different way. And then we have the length, height, and width.